Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm on another roundtable discussion with Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Terminal Philosophy. We're here to discuss the Second Amendment, but more broadly, the sort of legal historical principle of the right to carry and bear arms. So if we look at it from the Western perspective, we sort of have three independent avenues that sort of have sort of been synthesized in the 17th and 18th century English and American law about the right to bear arms. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Republic was required to have all of its adult males capable of bearing arms. So in Numbers 1:3, we read, from 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel, you and Aaron shall number them by their armies. But in a way analogous to what many modern libertarians advocate on independent lines of reasoning, while the population might have been competent to bear arms, they were not coerced to fight. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, it essentially lays out the groundwork for a volunteer army where you can't really coerce anybody into fighting. So in that regards, the Hebrew Republic was very libertarian and ahead of its time from the point of view of a modern liberal or capitalist or libertarian or anarchist perspective. And then we have what we might call the barbarian camp, which would be the Celtic tribes of Gaul and the Germanic tribes. So Tacitus describes in the Germania that the Germans would never conduct any sort of public or private business without carrying their weapons, which amounted at that time to javelins. Caesar records that the Gauls, every man was trained for war, and that if the man didn't show up, he was killed in sight of the assembly if he showed up late or something. So, they took that very seriously. And so Caesar would always try to disarm the Gauls when he went up against them. We see also Aristotle in his Politics writes that in a democratic society or democratic city-state, light armed troops and the Navy, he mentions Athens in this category, is sort of the backbone of that force, because it's sort of a people's weapon. Now, Aristotle uses the term siloi, which could either relate to archers, slingers, or javelin men, or probably a combination of all three. And so there is this connection between missile weapons, but not exclusively missile weapons, and a sort of armed citizenry, the Germanic tribes, the Celts, the Greeks. And we find that in the Vikings, in the ancient German societies as well, they were all adult free men were required to have arms and be skilled in their use. So it's a duty and a right. So in the sense, you have the right to bear these weapons, but you also have a duty to know how to use them. Now, for our perspective, and from the English-speaking world, the direct legal precedent is Henry II's Assizes of Arms, 1181. And I think at least a portion of it bears repeating. Moreover, every free layman who possesses chattels or rents of the value of 16 M shall have a shirt of mail, a helmet, a shield, and a lance. And every free layman possessing chattels or rents to the value of 10 marks shall have a harbuk, an iron cap, and a lance. Item, all burgesses and the whole community of free men shall each have a gambeson, an iron cap, and a lance. Now, this is actually similar to how the ancient Greeks equipped the hoplites, where you had a certain economic threshold that if you reached it, you were then required to equip yourself. Now, what's interesting is the Royal Statute of 1363 by Edward III. The longbow was equivalent to the AR-15 in the gun control debate in the Middle Ages. And the king was so concerned that the people of England know how to use it. The only sport allowed on Sunday was archery. A brief excerpt from this law is, whether the king's subjects not lame or having no lawful impediment in being within the age of 11 years, except spiritual men, justices, and barons of the exchequer, using shot on longbows and have a bow continually in his house to use himself, and that fathers and governors of children teach them to shoot, and that the bows and arrows be bought for children under the age of 17, and above all, 7 years. So we see that they wanted to cultivate that as well. And one of the great debates is, why didn't the French ever copy this? Right? It's so effective. Well, the main reason why the French didn't copy it was they were afraid that the peasants would rise up and overthrow them. It was so effective at killing them on the battlefield in the hands of English peasants, they didn't want the French peasants to get any ideas. One of the great philosophical modern thinkers on this topic is Machiavelli. Machiavelli writes in The Prince, an experience has shown princes and republics single-handed making the greatest progress and mercenaries doing nothing except damage. And it is more difficult to bring a republic armed with their own arms under the sway of one of its citizens than it is to bring one armed with foreign arms. Rome and Sparta stood for many ages armed and free. The Switzers are completely armed and quite free. In the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli makes the observation that France was under the thumb of first the English and then the Swiss, because the English and the Swiss trusted their own men with arms, but the French king did not. We see constitutional precedent in the English Bill of Rights of 1689 that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions as allowed by law. And then coming right up to the constitutional era, the Constitution of Virginia, which was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in times of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. And so really the main reason why this tradition became finally codified in the 17th and 18th centuries was a hedge against tyranny. Numerous historians had observed that it was a hedge, Aristotle, Machiavelli, but it wasn't necessarily written in this sort of like precedential law form that we saw in the 17th and 18th centuries, certainly in the English-speaking world, and I think also in Switzerland. And so it's this hedge against tyranny, because really the army you fear the most is not some foreigner's army, but actually your own government's army. And one of the things that the radical left will often say is, well, yeah, but the assizes of arms didn't allow the Jews to have arms. Or, the English Bill of Rights didn't allow Catholics to have arms. Or the American Constitution didn't protect the black man's right to bear arms. And then they say, well, we should disarm everyone. And I'm like, well, that's insane. So just because some people are treated as slaves and chattel, you want to treat all of us as slaves and chattel. That's a real galaxy brain take there. So that's just a brief survey of the history of the right to bear arms and how the West distinguishes itself from the East in that regard. Keith, what are some of your thoughts on the precedent for the Second Amendment?
Well, you've provided a pretty good overview of all of the historical roots that lead up to that concept. And one thing that's interesting about the information you went over is that it transcends a lot of different time periods and a lot of different cultural groups and a lot of different religions, Christian, Jewish, pagan, whatever. So this is something that's been recognized in many different kinds of societies since time immemorial. You mentioned Machiavelli. Machiavelli thought that a ruler that tried to disarm their people was making a serious mistake, and he was looking at this purely from a pragmatic perspective. He thought that countries that had a disarmed population would be much more easily conquered. One thing that I would point out is there was some interesting research that was put out some years ago by a group called the Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. And this was a group of Jewish people who were pro Second Amendment. This was an American group. But they were comparing genocides that happened, say, in the 20th century. Say that the Armenians, the Holocaust, the Pol Pot, Idi Amin, all that kind of stuff. And they pointed out that one thing that all of these genocides had in common was that prior to that, there had been a disarmament campaign in the particular society in which this happened, and then often under previous regimes. For instance, they talked about how in Weimar, Germany, because Weimar had a lot of problem with terrorism and stuff like that, that there were stricter and stricter gun laws that were enacted. And then the Third Reich, built on that. Now, the Third Reich would also, I guess the American term would be deputized these extra legal militias and stuff like that as well. But in all of these kinds of situations, you had a system where civilian disarmament was a predecessor to often some future regime that actually practiced genocide. And It's really funny today. You mentioned this example, Todd. Today you will hear people who are anti-Second Amendment say, "Well, actually, the Second Amendment doesn't really give anyone the right to bear arms because it was only supposed to mean, what the modern equivalent would be the National Guard. It only meant the states could have their own militias as opposed to the federal government or something like that." And then they will also say, well, and we've always had gun control, and yeah, as you pointed out, we've had gun control where slaves couldn't have guns and Native Americans couldn't have guns. So anybody that the state wants to keep down, yeah, those are the people, precisely the people they want to disarm. But I also think it's really interesting how completely neurotic modern anti-gun people are. Whenever I've encountered people from that side of the political or cultural spectrum, I've noticed that this is one of their primary articles of faith. That we got to have gun control or gun laws. It's right up there alongside all the identitarian stuff. Like the worst evils in the world are racism, sexism, homophobia, and guns and climate change. And so it really is something that's become an article of faith. But I think it's in a way that's totally ahistorical in terms of its its justifications.
Yeah, Swithin, what are some of your thoughts on the precedents thus far?
Oh yeah, I entirely agree with your overview when it comes to the guns, and in particular your response to the criticism that the essay of arms wasn't really sort of individual ownership of guns. It was it was so the king could have a ready group of troops. And as you point out, well, why didn't the French do it? Why didn't anyone else do it? Well, because they probably would have taken over in that case. So that is clearly one of the older precedents of it, and also I think shows to a large extent that prior to the 20th century, I mean, at least let's take prior to say the 19th century in England, there was no sort of police force. You kind of basically defended yourself. Well, you had the shires, and you had their own sort of policing organizations to some extent, but there was no sort of like state police or even sort of local police in the sense of the local constabulary that we have in England, that have been since Peel in the mid 19th century. It recognizes that individuals and families and local communities are responsible for their own security in a way that they aren't assumed to do so today, where a lot of this is then sort of farmed out to the police, the military, and all we do specialized people, so we don't have to do the icky things of dealing with violence to a large extent. That's kind of how it's gone, and I think it shows quite clearly what's kind of happened with that. I mean, following on, I mean, this is going away possibly slightly from where we were beginning. But Todd, you're right. In England, we basically don't have any regulated firearms until the 1920s. I mean, they are regulated to some extent, but the main first one was the Firearms Act of 1920. And the main reason that was put in was because the Irish were revolting, and the British government feared a working class revolt. The 1920s, if you may or may not be aware, in England was not the best time of labour relations, and we had one of our few general strikes in 26. And so, yeah, they were concerned that yes, we were not going that if we had let the proles have guns, then things might end up badly for us. Now, that wasn't clearly the official reason for it. The official reason was to enable the control of the overseas arms trade, fulfill his commitment to 1919 Paris Arms Convention. But in reality, that the main reason was probably to keep down the working class revolution, which may or may not have taken place. So your point with respect to revolt, and Keith's with respect to the massacres seems to be borne out in a more softer sense, at least in England. So that's sort of like my opening thoughts on the matter.
All right, your opening thoughts, Terminal.
Right. Well, your historical introduction was really good and really broad. It's definitely true to say that what Keith was saying earlier, that that Machiavelli had advised against discouraging the ownership of weapons, as it will not really play out very well for your authority. And so, of course, there's all of these sorts of historical examples where you can see that discouraging firearm ownership or weapons ownership isn't not only, it's not pragmatic for a ruler, but it's also, your populace, your subjects or your citizens, whoever it might be, will find it, highly suspect as to why you're trying to do that. So, yes, of course, there's this whole historical side to it. One thing that I've sort of found interesting in sort of gun ownership, the culture surrounding guns in various countries, is that both the global violent crime and U.S. violent crime has been going down fairly close to each other since about 1991. So it's fairly interesting to see the anti-gun groups and politicians throughout the West sort of try to reinvent their rhetoric in regards to gun laws and the culture surrounding firearm ownership. And, of course, a more modern day example of this might be, the Democrats have a really interesting modern history in how they sort of are chipping away at various aspects of owning firearms. Maybe they don't try and go after it directly, although I'm sure we'll discuss that soon with our friend Joe Biden. And it's interesting to observe the state side versus the federal side of firearm ownership. I mean, just take a moment to reflect on California gun laws versus gun laws in, say, Alabama or Utah or Kansas, things like that. So, and then as we'll get to here in a moment too, there's definitely a growing, although it's fairly small and I would say underground and fairly anecdotal, but of course it's well known that many in the modern day left aren't particularly, they don't have the affinity for owning firearms. They, it's either something they don't get, or it's, it looks violent. They don't like the aesthetics, you name it. However, there is certainly a growing interest from those on the, the broadly, what you could broadly call the socialist left, that are interested in firearm ownership and trying to get more people of that political persuasion to own firearms. And so, but the larger statistics surrounding gun violence and violent crime, by and large, both with the U.S. and this broader global trend of falling violent crime, is really interesting because of course there's never been so many guns on Earth in general, and so it makes you wonder. It does make one wonder what role firearms play in terms of keeping a relative state of peace, both at the United States, in Europe, and across the world.
Yeah. Now, within the English context and the American context, even before it's strictly codified in the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, there was the general assumption that there was no real limitation on the amount of quote unquote heat that a civilian could pack. Whatever was equivalent to military grade weapons was available for private individuals. Again, those that were included in it, Catholics couldn't have it until much later because the English Bill of Rights only covers Protestants. But if you were covered, then you could have up to military grade. So the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. So there's a couple things I want to say about that. One is there's a common argument from the left, from anti-gun control people on the left today, pro-gun control people on the left today, that, well, it wasn't including military grade weapons. But that's clearly a fatuous argument, right? Because we have the American privateers of the Revolution in 1812, and they used cannons. Privately owned contractors were buying military grades cannons. The only real limit to what a privateer could outfit was the cost. In fact, the U.S. federal government couldn't even, outfit a ship of the lines, let alone a private contractor. The largest ship a contractor could probably produce was a frigate, but it was a military grade frigate. It wasn't, it wasn't something that there was some law against, competing with the U.S. Navy. And so it's obvious that there was no limit on what, other than financial, what a private citizen could have in terms of weapons. And then, what is the well-regulated militia and what was it supposed to be used for? Now, again, the pro-gun control side will say, well, it's not meant to overthrow the government. It's not meant to keep the government honest. You're crazy. Well, I won't read the whole thing, but Federalist number 46 by James Madison totally eviscerates this fatuous argument. Let a regular army fully equipped to the resources of the country be formed, and let it be entirely at the devotion of the federal government. Still, it would not be going too far to say that the state governments, with the people on their side, would be able to repel the danger. The highest number to which, according to the best computation, a standing army can be carried in any country does not exceed 1/100th of the part of the whole of the number of souls, or 1/25th part of the number able to bear arms. This proportion would not yield in the United States any army of more than 25 or 30,000 men. To these would be opposed a militia amounting to near 500,000 of citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men chosen from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence. It may well be doubted whether a militia thus circumstanced could ever be conquered by such proportion of regular troops. Those who are best acquainted with the last successful resistance of this country against the British arms will be more inclined to deny the possibility of it. Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of. Notwithstanding the military establishments in the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust their people with arms. And it is not certain that with this aid alone, they would not be able to shake off their yokes. But were the people able to possess the additional advantages of local governments chosen by themselves, who could collect the national will and direct the national force, and of officers appointed out of the militia, by these governments and attached both to them and to the militia, it may be affirmed with the greatest assurance that the throne of every tyranny in Europe would be speedily overturned in spite of the legions which surrounded it. So, I mean, this is pretty much as cut and dry and open and closed as you can get. And only, well, to quote Machiavelli, only someone who has ill intentions would produce such a spurious argument that the well-regulated militia was not meant to be a deterrent against a standing army. And I think so. Looking at it as it was written by the Founding Fathers, given their explanations and commentaries in their own letters and in the Federalist Papers, the intent of the Second Amendment was to have a large body of militia able to, again, it was more of a deterrent. They didn't want to have to fight the federal army, but they thought, well, we still might need one to fight the Europeans, but what do we do to stop them? And this is essentially the same as the argument that I had, or the discussion that I had with David Friedman. Small amount of professionals, balanced out by a large militia force. And then second of all, the only limitation on the weapons grade material you could buy is your own finances. So today, I think in modern day terms, a Second Amendment purist would say, well, 155 millimeter howitzer, RPG, all of that would go, because the only limit would be, could you pay for it? And especially if the goal of the militia is to resist the federal authorities, they would have to have military grade weapons. Otherwise, there's no way they could resist the authorities. So I think from the explanatory notes given by the Founding Fathers and a century of Anglo-American jurisprudence, this is a completely fatuous argument. I'll start with you, Keith.
Yeah, well, gun control people, when they say the Second Amendment doesn't really give individuals the right to bear arms, what they will point to is the clause in the Second Amendment that says a well-regulated militia is necessary for the security of the state or something like that. Therefore, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. but it's obvious they don't really know their history of militias, because when they're saying a well-regulated militia, they mean, yes, in the sense of the command structure. Like they thought that the people who created the Second Amendment thought that the individual states ought to have something akin to what we would call the National Guard or the state militias, where they would have a command structure that was well regulated, so that the militia just couldn't become a group of pirates or something like that. But the militia was made up of the individual members of society. It wasn't a professional army, and to be in a militia, a citizen militia, you have to have weapons, which means that individuals had to have the right to own and keep weapons in their households and things like that. I mean, that's no other reading of the Second Amendment is possible. And plus, in context, like you quoted some of the Federalist Papers and some of those documents. If you go and you read that stuff in context, it's clear that's what that means. What they envisioned, the founders of the United States envisioned, was something kind of like what they have in Switzerland, which is you have a public militia, and it's comprised of individuals who aren't full-time professional soldiers, and then they have their own weapons and they keep them in their household and all of that. Now, I suppose you could make an argument, well, the government could still have the power to regulate, for example, carrying weapons in public, like going to a bar and carrying a gun or something like that. I suppose you could make some peripheral arguments like that. But the general concept, though, that the militia is the common people, and the right to bear arms means individuals, not just organizations. I think that's obvious from an honest reading of the Second Amendment and then the documents that are involved in the writing of the Constitution. Now, a lot of contemporary people, though, they will say, yeah, but that's anachronistic. There's no way a modern civilian army could fight a modern professional army, particularly not when the government has nuclear weapons and bombers and that kind of thing. To which I always say, well, tell that to the Taliban, tell that to the Viet Cong, tell that to the Iraqis, tell that to, all of these other ragtag civilian armies all over the world that have beaten major armies in long-scale, protracted guerrilla warfare. I mean, the Afghans, Hezbollah, their successful efforts to repel Israel twice, the Vietnamese, many others. Look how poorly the United States, which is the most powerful military apparatus in history, look how poorly the United States has performed in their wars with precisely these kinds of armies for the last 50 years. So that's not really much of an argument. I think the issue there, though, is just most gun control people are just middle-class Americans with a very genteel middle-class type of sensibility, or upper class. They just don't like violence. They're squeamish about violence. They think, oh, guns, that's what all those icky, trailer park people like, or those scary inner city black people, and I think that's just where it comes from. It's just an aesthetic a judgment as much as anything else, and I think it's to a large degree rooted in class prejudice.
All right, Swithun, what are your thoughts on the Anglo-American legal precedent of modern times for guns?
I was going to mention the context of the Bill of Rights of 1689 in England, which more than anything else was a codification of the power of Parliament over the King. If any of you know your English history reasonably well, there's the English Civil War. I can never remember the dates. Middle part of the 17th century. You have the interregnum with Cromwell, with the Republic. Then the King comes back, and then there's a king who's Catholic and who isn't very popular, and then Parliament get annoyed and get rid of him, and replace him with William of Orange. And really, the Bill of Rights is kind of a codification of the victory of Parliament over the monarch. And really, since the late 17th century, you could really say that England wasn't really a monarchy in the European sense anymore. It was very much a strength of Parliament. So one of the provisions, say, in the Bill of Rights of 1689 is that there would be no standing army without the consent of Parliament. A lot of it was about the power of Parliament. that said, yes, they do give the right to bear arms back to the Protestants because the arms were taken from, I believe, by James II. So the context there, at least in the English context, when it was sort of obviously directly codified, was really a way of preventing the king from overthrowing Parliament in their overall influence. But as you say, I mean, it was generally assumed, that men of decent standing would have been expected to carry arms and weaponry, and to whatever they could afford to buy. I mean, it's interesting that Keith mentions with respect to the Taliban and Hezbollah, etc., beating the American military, and people respond, "Oh, how could you possibly have stand up against a modern military force like the Americans?" It's like, well, let us get something that isn't just a puny little pistol. It's like, gun control, being able to stand up to an army, as I mentioned before, requires having access to weapons grade, like military grade weaponry, which is obviously going to be necessary if you're coming up against bombers, fighters, tanks, etc. That's what you're going to need. So the English context was about the maintaining Parliament's power primarily. But as I say, it was generally assumed that an Englishman had the rights to carry arms. Even like 14-year-olds until like 1938 could buy shotguns. That was perfectly normal and fine. And it's really only since, as I say, the Firearms Act of 1920 that there's really be a tightening through when it comes to gun ownership as such.
Yeah, terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, with being separated from most of the world by two oceans, the United States has seen itself throughout history as a country with the ability to maintain or to continue the expansion of individual rights. And of course, this also extends to firearms. With Keith's earlier comments, I generally agree that in as a broad conception, a well-regulated militia basically means an armed group of common people that don't represent the government. I think or at least not officially. And of course, if the if the aliens from Independence Day show up, then maybe they would be more tempted to represent the United States government on its behalf. But by and large, they are anti-government authority and not so much as an extension of anything of the government itself. I think that's sometimes a misconception by those, at least some anti-gun people on the left. I also agree with what Keith was saying earlier that the perception of militias and firearms more broadly is an unappealing culture and aesthetic. There's this very sort of ahistorical assumption that everything will always be fine and civilizations and societies never fail, and firearms are just sort of a scary piece of equipment, and why would I want to associate with those NASCAR fans and this and that. And so if you've ever been to any big city, it's really easy to tell that there is a culture that's just not interested in guns, and that modern life doesn't require guns. And so again, it really is there's a really interesting cultural factor that plays into all of this. But I think I'll leave my comment at that.
Yeah. Now, the first major act of gun restriction in the United States was the National Firearms Act of 1934, which created a mandatory registration for machine guns, short-barreled rifles, shotguns, and other heavy weapons. And the purported reasoning behind this was, well, we need to cut off the gun supply to organized crime. And I know you'll appreciate this take, Swithun. How about instead of cutting off the gun supply to organized crime, you cut off the revenue stream by legalizing alcohol? leave it to the federal government to fight the problem in the dumbest way possible. But the point is, though, as we've seen even today, organized crime will always have access to quality grade firearms and explosives and whatever they need. So I don't really think that these sort of superficial arguments, oh, we do it for this reason, that's just for public consumption. I mean, some people are probably gullible enough to believe it, but I don't believe the people in charge are really that stupid. They know what they're doing, and they're disarming the population. It's just that you can't say that, because especially in America and in England, people are going to be like, well, I remember that rhetoric before, and they wouldn't buy into that. And but I think what's I think interesting and illustrative of the importance of having private citizens being able to have firearms that are of that quality. Oh, when Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed by the six-man posse led by the former Texas Ranger Frank Hammer, three of the posse had BARs, which are broadening automatic rifles. They shoot a 30-06 with, I think, a 10, 20-round clip. And full automatic. I mean, you just position yourself in the right position and just let it rip. Bonnie and Clyde's car was essentially a traveling arsenal. Like, they had to open up with the biggest guns they had, and that was the BAR. And again, presumably some of these were probably owned by the former civilians, now deputized law officers. And so in order to fight organized crime, and this is, of course, 1 year before the Firearms Act of 1934, it's really difficult to envision how they could defend themselves. And we see a similar problem like in the inner city, where a lot of these organized crime syndicates have all the guns. And a lot of these, low-income communities are just, always complaining about drive-bys. The police won't show up to do their job, and they're not able to defend themselves either. And, you were saying terminal philosophy. A lot of these people say, well, we don't need guns to be safe. I guess it depends on what part of the country you live in, because if you live in the inner city, you're not very safe if you don't have any. And so what I think we need to do when we look at these laws that are being rolled out, it's never as it seems. What it is they have to have some sort of presumably plausible pretext to disarm the population for nefarious reasons. And this is something that I think a lot of people miss. Even nonviolent champions of nonviolence like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi understood the need for the legal precedence of something like a Second Amendment. There was a book written by a radical black activist in the 1960s called Negroes with Guns, and the introduction was written by Martin Luther King Jr. So, I mean, they understood that, under the pretext that monopolies are bad, the government having a monopoly on violence is very bad. It's just that that's not the policy that they would want to use to change society. But they still understood that, hey, if the government's the only one having the guns, that's really bad for all of us. And again, that's sort of been memory hold as well. Just because you have the right to do something under the law doesn't mean you have to. And you can have, moral principles or religious principles that would prevent you from standing on this or that right. But I think that we've seen from history that the results of disarming the population completely are catastrophic. And as you pointed out earlier, Keith, in the Jewish Second Amendment group you mentioned, many of these groups that were genocided in the 20th century either were not armed or were systematically disarmed. And you'll look at, again, the critics of gun ownership saying, well, how would that have been any different? Let's say use the example of the Nazis and the Jews. If the Jews had had guns, they still would have been outnumbered and destroyed. Well, I mean, maybe, but there are. You could put to the Swiss example in World War II. They deterred Nazi aggression by the mere presence of having this nation in arms that the founding fathers were talking about. And the Swiss didn't have to have panzer divisions and bomber wings and all of these other really high-tech, expensive weapon systems to deter the Nazi invaders. They just had to have this Second Amendment principle. So I guess what would be your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, well, I think it's clear that the authorities that seek absolute societal control always try to exercise civilian disarmament. I mean, there's never been a totalitarian regime, for example, like a fascist or communist regime that allowed the people to have arms because they know that the people are going to resist if they get pushed too far. What I see happening now in the United States is interesting because a number of different things are converging. We did a program on not long ago about how one of the negative consequences of the anti-police movement we see today is that it doesn't mean police are going to go away. It just means that we're going to see greater reliance on, mercenaries like Blackwater and stuff like that. And I think that that ties in with gun control because I actually posted something about this on Facebook earlier today. But I think one of the consequences of this, of the anti-police movement, is that whatever criticisms there could be of, say, local police departments, and there are plenty of them, but that doesn't mean that police are going to go away. What's going to happen is that there's probably going to be a pullback of policing in certain parts of cities, large cities, like for example, predominantly black areas, and then crime is actually going to increase in those areas. And there's some evidence that's already started. And then that in turn is going to lead to renewed calls for law and order. Well, we can't have crime. And then that's going to be used to federalize the policing in the United States, where you're going to have the Justice Department and the Democratic Party and all of that coming out and say, well, the real problem is local police departments, because they're full of low IQ, racist rednecks and who go out and beat up and kill black people. So what we really need is to federalize policing, and we'll just put the DHS and the FBI and the ETF, we'll put them in charge of policing. So you'll create a kind of national paramilitary police force that overrides local police departments. And I heard a cop say once that it would be hard to have a coup in the United States because the police are spread out among 18,000 police departments, and even the military spread out through different types of military: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, etc. But I think what's probably going to happen in the future is there's going to be a movement to create a national police force in the United States. It's going to be a variation of the national police forces we have now, in the name of eradicating supposedly abusive, incompetent, racist local police departments. And then, of course, the national police will be supplemented by private police, Blackwater and all that, providing security for gated communities and all of this kind of stuff. Parallel to that, there'll be increased efforts to chip away at the Second Amendment and the right of individuals to bear arms as well. So that seems to me to be the way things are going to likely unfold in the future in the United States. And I mean, I've seen that in other countries. That happened in Mexico. In Mexico, they have fairly strict gun control laws, but they also have terrible violence and terrible crime. It's one of the worst countries in the world in terms of crime. And in some of the Mexican cities, the police are extremely, unbelievably corrupt, incompetent, violent, etc. And they've actually had situations in Mexico where they send out the army to police the police. Like they just put the police directly under the control of the army for that reason. And it seems to me as the United States becomes more and more like a Latin American country, that's probably the direction we're going to go in as well. On the question of armaments, one thing though that's kind of funny is that a lot of times anti-gun people show they know absolutely nothing about guns, because if you say, well, I don't think there should be any limits on gun ownership, they will say, yeah, but that means everybody's going to have a machine gun. Well, first of all, no, they're not, because machine guns are expensive. Buying the ammunition for those is cost prohibitive for most people. Also, no criminal with half a brain is going to use that kind of weaponry to rob a liquor store. I mean, experts in guerrilla warfare will tell you that in guerrilla warfare, what you want is not that kind of weaponry. What you want are things like high-powered rifles and fully automatic handguns and things like that, or sawed-off shotguns. That's the kind of stuff you'd want to use in guerrilla warfare because it's easy to carry and use, not stuff where you have to have a whole posse of people to carry a weapon and the ammunition for it. So they really don't know anything about weapons when they make that kind of argument. So you see people, it's kind of, whenever I talk to anti-gun people, it's kind of like the blind leading the blind. I mean, they really just don't know what they're talking about most of the time.
Yeah. So Swithun, your thoughts?
It's interesting, the origin of the gun registration in the US. I was unaware that was the start of it. So it's unsurprising because it reminds me of the theory I heard that one of the reasons why certain groups wanted the 27th the amendment to ban alcohol. I can't remember which amendment it was that was passed. It was supported in some quarters because they knew this would be a good way of increasing the funding for the police, because they knew that this was likely to happen, and obviously we have increasing crime, so you need more of the police, and then of course you can justify gun control. I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to gun control in the West in general, the US and the UK, is democracy. Everybody still seems to think that it's our government. Well, not everybody. There's increasingly not being the case, but there is still the idea that there is democratic legitimacy for the U.S. government, for the British government, etc. And so, they're not really going to be the they're not going to be National Socialist Germany or Stalinist Russia. They're not going to turn on everybody and start shooting them and disappearing dissidents off. Because we have democracy, we can vote these people in and we can vote them out. Now that is, I think, wearing a bit thin now with the legitimizing ideology, but it's still very much there. And people think, well, we just want sensible controls. We don't want crazy people to go and get guns because they could go out and kill everybody. Which is like, well, yeah, I suppose that's possible, but then you're not taking into account abuse of power, governments, etc., etc. So I do think it's certainly the case that a lot of the victim disarmament is deliberate, and people in power know exactly what they're doing. But I think when it comes to sort of promoting guns, I think a positive program probably is going to be a better way of doing this. I mean, I suppose if you want to rhetorically, you should probably say that you want guns for women because it's a way of equalizing and preventing violence against them. That's how you should go about promoting it. But it is obviously true. I mean, when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. I mean, like it's obviously true that people require their own protection just from against general criminals. So I think a more concerted effort on that part, just to say the positive case. I mean, not just like against tyranny, against the government, but just in general. If as you point out, Todd, if why do you need guns? Well, if you're in a city, you kind of need guns because you've got to protect yourself. But also just to recognize that anybody can be a victim of crime in the most unsurprising circumstances, and so it's not unreasonable to be able to protect yourself. When it comes to government tyranny, I would have thought that the year of lockdown 2020 would have radicalized people against the state, although unfortunately in most cases made them love it even more. So how optimistic I can be in this regard is not very, at least not at the moment.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Right. I definitely agree with Keith's earlier comment in the direction in which American law enforcement is heading. Our friend Right Ruminations said something interesting a while ago in which he predicted that the United States will slowly start to resemble the political and sort of cultural situation in places like Brazil. I think that's a likely outcome to unfold over the course of the next I don't know, perhaps 40 years or so. And I believe this Brazilification, if you don't mind the term, is also going to be implemented in part on law enforcement with federal entities like the FBI and the ATF and other organizations. Other organizations like this will be given more power over state authorities. Uh, Many South American countries just simply have the federal police, and that's that. There's no aspect of local law enforcement. And I do believe, I don't quote me on this, but I do believe that this is the case for countries like Colombia, who have just seen, some violent protests in places in a city called Cali, and there's lots of protests in Bogota. And I believe that the Colombian government just has something very similar to this, where it's just like they have one large police force that's federal, and that I don't know if I don't know to even what degree that Colombia has, something like sheriff's departments or deputies or anything on a more local, state, or provincial level. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, and there's some earlier comments made too about sort of the anti-gun crowd making, just making it fairly clear that they don't know a lot about guns. And I mean, it's fine. It's one thing if there's some cultural thing going on out there in the world that you're not interested in, but it's an entirely different thing to report your I don't know, to basically impose your impressions as as the accurate version of the narrative as far as guns go. And so you would think for a moment that if like liberated, independent, culturally left-wing women who live alone in a dirty apartment in a big city would at least find it necessary to own at least a pistol or something like that. And it doesn't mean you have to go join the rodeo or go to the Dale Earnhardt Jr. Remembrance, what have you. But you would think that would be a part of this sort of this more now largely prevailing left-wing culture of of independence, of of liberation. And then this is a way to this is a way for me to deter the authorities from entering my my property. But yeah, there's a really interesting sort of back and forth clashing within the left about firearm ownership. And as I was mentioning before, there is this growing interest, although it's fairly small and fairly underground. Let's see. Yeah, there's this growing interest in the socialist left in firearm ownership, and the first. The best example of this that I'm aware of is the Socialist Rifle Association, and they're reported to have a membership of something like around like 10,000 members, although who knows how accurate that number really is. There are all sorts of small groups like this and identitarian groups throughout the United States, whether they're left or right politically. And as for organizations like the Socialist Rifle Association, their presence seems to be, in part, an attempt to turn mostly politically innocuous left of center people into socialist gun owners who would presumably be waiting for something like the worldwide workers' revolution, or waiting for the toppling of the American government, or something like that. And so there is sort of you have that one group where you have folks like the Socialist Rifle Association and self-described Marxists who own firearms. I think another guy, maybe not the best example, but one example that comes to mind is a guy named on YouTube. I think his name is Jason Unruh or something like that, who's I think somewhat of a self-described communist, or maybe a tanky. You'll have to forgive me on that one, but he is an example of a Marxist, or at least a self-described communist who advocates for gun ownership. And then so you have that side, and then the other side is that you have sort of the more like left-wing neoliberal class of voters, and suburban young urban crowd who didn't grow up with firearms, never was interested. They were sort of turned off by the aesthetics of firearms, for reasons that we've all been mentioning beforehand. So there's kind of an interesting shift within the broader left about gun control and firearm ownership in general.
All right, Keith, what are your final thoughts when we wrap up?
Yeah, the example that Terminal Philosophy gave just a moment ago of other countries that have a singular national police force. A while back, I was watching an interview that Coleman Hughes, he's a YouTuber, was doing with a guy who used to be a cop, who's now, I think, an attorney, or no, I think he's a professor of criminal justice or something. But this fellow was saying that when he was a policeman, he would often do engage in training exercises with members of police departments from other countries. And he would say that he would meet policemen from other countries who would be surprised that at how many different police forces the United States has. You know, that every city, every county, every village, whatever, has its own police department. Because in some countries that is the norm. You have just a single national police for the entire country. Now, most countries aren't as large as the United States. That's another thing that has to be considered. So there is a context there. But yeah, in many countries, that's the norm. You have just the national police force, just like you've got the national army. And I think that increasingly is the way the powers that be want to move in the United States. I think they want to move towards a national police force, eradicating local police departments. Of course, as they move in that direction, they'll wrap it up in some kind of, being inclusive, social justice, whatever kind of framework. We know that that's a scam. Um, but I do think that is the direction we're headed in, and Brazil is an interesting model because we are becoming more and more in the United States like a Latin American country. In fact, I was on another program last night where we were talking about this. We were saying that the United States is increasingly resembling Latin America, where in Latin America you have very wide divisions between the rich and poor. You have a very opulent rich, and they live in gated communities with their own private armies and security guards and all of that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, in the general society, Latin America is the most violent region of the United States. It has the highest, of the world. It has the highest per capita homicide rate of any region of the world. It's even worse than the Middle East. Most people think the Middle East is the world's most violent region, but outside of places like Syria or Afghanistan, was a literal war going on. Latin America is actually the most violent region in the world. So I see the United States going in that kind of direction, where we're going to look more like Mexico and Brazil and Colombia and Peru and some of these places, or the Central American countries. At the same time, though, what's going to be interesting is that culturally we're more and more looking like Western Europe. We're looking more and more like the Scandinavian countries and the UK and the Netherlands. We have this kind of woke political ideology in this ruling class that has this, at least adopts that as its self-legitimating ideological superstructure. We can debate how much they really believe that, but that seems to be the kind of society we're developing. We're developing this kind of hybrid Western European and Latin American society that is going to be like Latin America in terms of politics and economics, but culturally more like Western Europe. So, and the gun issue that we're talking about on this is going to be a big part of that. And I see that's the direction we're going to be headed there, I believe.
All right, Swithun Dobson, final thoughts.
I think what will help a move towards more civilian gun ownership and the lower restriction of it is a general change in outlook of the society, in which we have a greater application of innocence until proven guilty in most, or if not all, aspects of life. The regulatory state basically assumes that you are guilty until proven innocent. Which has been amplified clearly in the lockdowns. You've basically been assumed to be a bioweapon unless proven otherwise. And actually, even if you have been proven otherwise, you still have to stay in your house. So there needs to be a wide cultural change, I think, in that direction. Now, obviously, of course, overt tyranny in the more obvious sense than there is at present could precipitate change. But I think the idea that you assume everybody is basically decent, at least on a political level, unless proven otherwise, needs to be taken in as a general cultural norm. And if not, then the focus will always be, oh, what about on the individual who is a miscreant and is going to cause trouble? And if that's the case, then you will never get anywhere.
All right, terminal philosophy. last words go to you.
I think I'll just leave my comments as they are. And yeah, thanks for having me as always. And I'll see you guys on the next one.
All right. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy, Keith Preston, and Swithun Dobson for joining us today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.